Hello and welcome to AI Caramba, the podcast where we dive into concrete real-world AI application and trends. I'm Thomas Vranken, your host, and today I'm lucky to be accompanied with Tim Schittekatte and Robbe Sneyders. Thanks for being here, both.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. So in today's episode, we want to discuss AI in the energy industry. Specifically, we want to talk about the current evolution of the energy industry, and of course, look at AI applications. What kind of challenges can be tackled with AI? We also want to discuss ethics and security and future business cases, future-proof business cases. So as I said, I'm lucky to have both of you guys. Tim, you're an expert in the energy market and regulation. You're currently working at FTI Consulting in London, and before that you were in Boston working for MIT. I think you're also currently assistant professor at the Florence School of Regulation. And you have a background in economics and engineering.
Correct.
Quite the CV. Did I miss anything?
No. I think in the energy sector you need to know a bit of engineering and a bit of economics. So I'm not really good at either of those, but at least I know a bit of both.
Yeah, you bridge. Perfect. Yeah, cool. And what are you working on these days, actually?
These days, so I moved to UK about 1 year ago. So most of the projects that I work for are UK related, even though we are active in the US, Australia, Middle East, EU as well. So in the UK, since about 3-4 years already, a long time actually, they started reviewing the way that the electricity market is currently designed, so-called REMA process. And now the last stretch of the REMA process is ongoing. So we are often tasked by the system operator, NISO, or by companies to support them in arguing why the current market design is not really fit for purpose and what we gotta change. So that's big modeling exercises. How much billion pounds can British consumers save if we change the electricity markets in way X, Y, Z? And then we quantify that and argue that in order to convince the government to make those changes. Yeah.
Okay, no pressure. Yeah, quite the modeling. But thanks a lot for being here. And Robbe, so you're a colleague from MI6. You are part of the office of the CTO, principal engineer, former head of delivery and advice, and currently you're focusing on the energy domain.
Yeah, that's right. So I try to understand the challenges the electricity sector, the energy sector is facing, and try to help come up with which AI solutions can help. So I also try to know a bit of both, know a bit of the energy industry, and know a bit more of AI with my background, but I mostly try to make that combination currently.
Yeah, super interesting. I know you for many years, like what got you to decide to focus on energy specifically?
I think a big part of it is the impact that you can have. I think it's a big societal challenge currently that we're facing with the whole energy transition. I believe that AI can help support that transition in some key parts of the system. That's where we want to help with ML6.
Yeah, super interesting. There again, thanks both for being here. I think you represent exactly the expertise we want to bridge today. So let's just get started with it. So maybe first we can look at the the energy industry as a whole. Maybe Tim, from your point of view, what are the current evolutions shaping the energy industry?
Yeah, I mean, even though the challenge is very large, I think it's very easy to explain. It's basically simple. It's by 2050, you want a climate neutral economy. That means electrify as much as you can, and at the same time, make your electricity production mix as green as you can, and try to do those two in parallel if you can. So these are just the big two trends, and both of them are very hard. And I think the one that is probably the hardest is not necessarily populating the electricity grid with lots of renewables, wind and solar and so on, because the economics are working in favor. The harder part might be to electrify things like transport and heating in buildings, because it's a lot more of a social challenge as well, like getting everybody on board to install that heat pump, building those networks, especially at local level, to allow those new uses of electricity to come in. So that the role of electricity versus other energy carriers. So right now, we were discussing before, electricity in terms of total energy use at global level is about 20-25%. The rest of that is still oil, gas, coal, whatever you want, like the petrol you burn in your car. That has to go to 60% is sort of, let's say, the bearish number. Maybe you can go to 80%, but what do you do with the other 20, 30, right? Sync fuels, hydrogen, those things. It's not really my expertise. But then that electricity grid at the same time, making that green, has been a sort of scary exercise. Say 20 years ago, if you talk to engineers, they say we'll never get more than 3-4% of renewables on the grid because we cannot control that. It's just crazy to put your security of electricity supply in the hands of factors you cannot control. But right now in Ireland, in south of Australia, you have moments of 70-80% of renewables, and in certain grids already above 100%, they're sort of exporting. Okay, technically it's a bit harder, but we're getting there. And I mean, right now in the US, the state that has adopted the most, installed the most solar and wind last year is Texas. And to be honest, Texas have been there. They don't care about climate change or all that stuff. They do it just because the cheapest way of getting electricity done. So that gives me quite a bit of hope that part of the challenge will get, but we got to work on both at the same time.
Okay, no, super interesting. So you said like renewable energy is now cheaper. What kind of got into what made the change for renewable energy?
I don't think it's cheaper everywhere, but especially in places that are endowed with enough wind resource or enough solar. Places like Texas is sort of like the best, or like Spain as well, same thing. It's cheaper because actually the Europeans have paid for it. I mean, maybe unfortunately or lucky, because we have been pushing massive amount of subsidies in those technologies since the early 2000s maybe. And that has pushed them over the boundary, because if you don't push those subsidies, these early technologies are just way too expensive. It's not competitive. So European electricity payers, especially Germans, have paid a lot for that. I think the idea was that by doing so, you create also local industry. So I remember the Germans having big factories for solar panels, and the Danes for windmills, the same for the Spanish. I think that sort of an industrial dream is not really come to fruition. I mean, all the solar panels now are being built somewhere else, but the wind industry we still have. So it's because of that public push, which you could justify in economics as so the innovation externality, that has happened. And now we just go forward. But I think populating a grid, as I said, with renewables, wind and solar and batteries is sort of relatively economic in many places of the world, up to level 70-80% on annual production of your total electricity production being those units. Then the last 20% gets really a bit tricky, especially the more you go into those last percentages, it becomes tremendously more expensive for that last bit. And there's a bit, let's say the holy grail in electricity is still that thing that every 3, 4, 5 years you have these few weeks without wind and solar. In the popular literature is called a Dunkelflaute, right? So there's no real cheap solution for that. Whereas like maybe we keep or build some nuclear power plants, but what do you do in those 5,000 or all these other hours that you don't need them because of massive capex to recover? Do you gonna produce hydrogen in these moments that you have excess wind and solar and then burn it during those weeks? But the efficiency of that is quite bad. I mean, you lose quite a lot by making it, and then you lose quite a lot by burning it. Massive interconnectors. Is there some seasonal storage? Iron batteries are coming, maybe some innovations in that space. That's still a bit like an open question. But if we solve that one, then I mean, cleaning up the grid is pretty straightforward, I would say.
Okay, pretty optimistic. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think I can agree to those things. I think if we go a bit deeper maybe and more towards AI, I think some other trends is a lot more data being available in the energy sector. So I think that's something that all the players need to be able to handle, a lot more smart control at end consumers as well. So I think those are two trends maybe to bring it a bit closer to the data and AI realm, which can connect the two.
Yeah, maybe to add to your point, because in electricity, it's always seen that there were like two challenges. One is sort of the seasonal thing, the holy grail I talk about. The other trouble that we always anticipated is like, yeah, what do you do? Because from an hour-to-hour moment, these sort of renewables can really change, and maybe our demand patterns can change as well. But I think there, like things like AI can really solve that fairly straightforward. I mean, because you have so much flexible consumption, steerable consumption that will come in, that really should not be a problem. I mean, people have already batteries in their basements, EVs. I think that is something that we need some innovation in, but it's not that crazy of a challenge.
Do you see the flexibility mostly as those kinds of things like energy storage, or also shifting energy usage in time, or how do you?
Both. Yeah, I mean, in the end, sort of demand shifting physically is almost the same as storage, right?
Yeah.
And what is an EV is something in the middle between those things. But if you look at the battery capacity that you add by just electrifying transport, it's way more than enough to at least deal with these, let's say, second to second, hour to hour, day to day type of fluctuation. When you go week to week, then it becomes a lot harder.
And is it mostly because of those dunkelflaute periods? Because if you look at like graphs from solar and wind, the first time I saw it, I was a bit surprised on how complementary they can be. So is it
depends on the granularity you look at it?
Yeah. It's on a month-to-month level. I think it evens out quite nicely. So is it needed like the whole year, or only for those specific periods to bridge those?
What exactly you mean is needed?
Seasonal storage.
Yes, and the problem is it's from a sort of financing perspective, because imagine you think, let's solve it with seasonal hydrogen, right? Or hydrogen generators, like in Germany they're planning to build some, and with some public support. Those generators for like 4 years, if you have like 4 great years, climate is working, demand is not too crazy, they don't have to burn 1 megawatt hour of hydrogen. They don't earn 0 money. And then that 1 year, they'll probably earn enough to be good for like 7-8 years of their revenues expected. Who will build that plant? You know, what investor, what bank will underwrite that loan? If you really, really need it, but we don't know when, but by the time you actually need it, you might be already bankrupt. So that's why you need things like capacity mechanisms, they call them in the electricity sector, or public support, because it's going to be very, very costly for society if these things don't show up, but it's extremely risky for the ones who are willing to invest in them. Yeah. So that is a bit of a complicated question. And we always had that problem in electricity because it's sort of a public good, but it just becomes more and more extreme in those cases where now electricity in 5-6 years, you already see it now, literally 60-70% of the time it's basically for free if you purely look at the wholesale cost. But then these few hours, it gets just very, very expensive, and that creates risk, even though it signals exactly what it needs to signal. It's sort of that scarcity and that abundance of that commodity.
Very interesting. So what I'm hearing is, again, there's a big ambition for the basically electrification of the energy industry. Some of the challenges are then for the society to kind of do the switch, also from a consumer level, to adopt electric technology, basically. Okay, so we started going a little bit there, but what are, maybe Robbe, in your experience, like the highest potential for application of AI in the energy industry?
Yeah. We have a couple of topics that we focus a lot on because we believe in the value of AI there. And I would say they're for different players split in 2 things. So it's the operational control, and then often more like investment decision taking. So you have this at the grid level, where you can help with operational control of the grid, congestion management and so on, but also then on the longer term to look at building or simulating investment cases for expanding the grid. We see the same for balanced responsible parties. That's like parties which connect to the grid and which need to ensure their portfolio is balanced, like most big suppliers are. There it's a bit the same. You optimize how they position their portfolio on the markets, but on the longer term, you can again help them decide like what is a better portfolio to have to bring to the market. And then on the side of the big energy consumers and producers, again the same, help with deciding like what kind of assets do you need to invest in, batteries or so on, and then also steering them in real time. So batteries or shifting consumption for large energy consumers. So I would say you have like these two axes, and for every big player in the energy market, I think both are very applicable, and there's things that AI can do to help.
Okay, so here you're talking more about investment management, but then long-term investment management.
Yeah, so I think we just said like there's a lot of uncertainty in investments. So helping make those decisions, helping simulate scenarios. What if markets will do this in the future? What if we have a scenario where there are a couple of years of this kind of status? I think those can help build business cases, can help be more informed when you need to decide, because these are really big capex decisions to make. So that's where we see that we can support our clients as well.
Yeah, and there again, very important decisions to make if we want to go, again, like if we want to compensate the renewable parts and, for example, invest in hydrogen plants, as you're saying. One question, we see often prediction is pretty much like a very standard AI use case. Of course, with renewable energy, you want to predict the production of electricity. Do you see that as a central AI use case?
Yeah, definitely. So I think forecasting is often at the basis of the things that I mentioned. Like if you want to stabilize the grid, you need to forecast what will happen on the grid so you can take actions. And then the same for players in the market. They need to forecast what will their production assets do, what will their consumption be, so they can balance this, or they know how to position this on the market to get a return on their investments. So it's often forecasts as an input, and then more control or decision mechanisms on top of that to decide how to use those or the information of those forecasts.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. Does this resonate? Did you see other applications of AI in your experience?
I think probably I would see more or less the same, but I would organize it differently. So from my more academic head, if you think in like the electricity value chain, there's sort of 4 segments. There's generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. Mm-hmm. With generation and retail often being competitive, not always everywhere in the world, and then distribution and transmission being regulated monopolies. So I would split up in the tasks of sort of AI in the competitive segments, like for-profit companies, what can they do? And what can they do for the regulated entities, which are the Elias in Belgium or the Enedis in France for distribution, for example. And then competitive, you can think, what can they do in wholesale? What can they do in retail, right? So for me, if I split it up like that in generation, there's all this stuff about, market parties, they're responsible for buying in the market and then actually delivering it. With renewables, that becomes more tricky. Same for retailers, they have to figure out how much their consumers are going to consume, and then you can sort of improve that prediction. Can also do things like predictive maintenance, that you sort of know, like, okay, I need to do maintenance to my nuclear reactor. I don't want to make that happen when actually electricity prices are really high, but I need to do it at a certain frequency because otherwise I'm going to run out of fuel. What is sort of the optimal combination of all these things, which you can do with OR, but machine learning can probably do a similar or better job. Then in the regulated parts, it's really, the system operator that, for example, has to decide on how much reserves do I need to procure for tomorrow? What are the probabilities that the grid is going down? I don't want to procure too much because in the end, I just pass through these costs to consumers. I don't want to procure too little because then everybody will look at me. There's a blackout because of that failure. So things there's lots of innovation. We used to, for example, procure many of the TSOs, so the transmission system operators, for 1 year. Every day they procure the same amount of reserves, which is sort of like very stupid, right? Because one day is a lot more risky than another day, depending on, are you importing, are you exporting? There's lots of solar, there's lots of demand or not. So now they're sort of dimensioning those reserves at a daily basis. Maybe you can go even more granular. That's all mean like saving out money, right? So there's also not only sort of looking at reserves, but also the grid, thinking about how do I make maintenance of my grid, which lines do I put out? If I put out a line, I need to watch out because I always have to comply with N-1, that whatever happens, then there needs to be another backup that my system doesn't blow up if there's one fault and all these kind of things. So that's where there's a lot of decision-making tools which have been in place since forever. I mean, because we have been running the electricity grid for what, maybe 100 years now. But these tools can definitely be improved with machine learning. Then yeah, this is all operational. You can also think about investment, as Rob was saying. But I think maybe the biggest case can be in retail, because we're so advanced in many things. But do you know how many kilowatt hours do you consume in a year? Do you know your peak load?
That's a very good
do
question.
Do you know your demand profile?
Yeah, that's a good question. As a data nerd, maybe I should know, but
you don't?
No, I definitely don't know.
I know, because I'm a bit of a freak at these things, but and mine is very low because I'm very few times at home. But this is where we're still in the Stone Age in terms of how do you use your electrical appliances. And also, I mean, there's a good reason to, right? Because we didn't have much flexibility. We were really like passive users of electricity. Even, again, I'm going to use Germany. They don't even have smart meters. Imagine, they still have mechanical meters. And in Belgium right now, it's a little bit better. So that's the first thing, have these smart meters, and then we have flexible appliances. But then there's so much work to be done in sort of a retailer or an aggregator, or whatever you want to call it, that starts learning about the habits of their consumers and can actually help them to reduce their electricity costs, to market their flexibility, and in that way save out costs, and in that way everybody's better off, right? Because this transition is gonna be costly anyhow. But if you're able to do these things, you might make it much more bearable. So at the consumer edge is really where we're nowhere near, and it's extremely important to just make it work from a social perspective, and probably also from a technical perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So how would that work? Like hypothetically, like is it something that needs to come then from the suppliers that need to have more dynamic prices or incentivize users to use electricity at a different moment? Or is it something more from the appliance or maybe even from the consumers?
Yeah, for the longest time, and I never really understood, maybe because I'm naive, but many of these suppliers don't really do that much. No. There's some theories about that. I mean, there's lots of what they call gentailers, vertically integrated companies that own generation, and then they also own retail. So what is the objective of their retailers? Maximize the amount of kilowatt hours that you consume, right? It's not optimizing that usage, because they're integrated. But now, every once in a while, you see companies that try to shock the system. The biggest example that is always used is Octopus Energy in UK, which is, one of our biggest clients, disclaimer, but at FTI Consulting. But they try to engage with consumers, and then they try to, for example, they sell you the heat pump, and they'll go the heat pump. With that heat pump, they'll give you the tariff. But they'll also operate your heat pump. But of course, in your app, you'll set like, okay, my temperature has to be that between hour this and that. And you do whatever you want to reach that, but do it in the cheapest way, and they take care of it. Same with electrical vehicle charging and so on. So there's a lot of business to be made, but the electricity regulation as well and markets, they have to move along, because also those ones have often been in the Stone Age to enable those business models, like things like Enalix, and there are these aggregators. The big one in Germany was Next Kraftwerke for the longest time, that has then been sold to the big oil majors. But these companies, they come, but it's still quite slow. But yeah, we're only at the start, right? 20-25%, and we need to get to 60-80%.
I think you need a lot of things. Indeed, you need to push the incentives to the end users, which is more on the supplier side. And you do see new suppliers coming up as well who have that as their core business model. Then you also see virtual power plants coming up, where we also have one of our ex-colleagues who is working on that, who group like end user flexibility and try to bring it as, like the name says, a virtual power plant to the grid, so you can steer on a aggregated level instead of having everyone to do it separately. And then you need to do that detailed steering as well. And I think there's a lot of fragmentation currently, which is, I think, also a very big problem. And that's one of the things then that such a virtual power plant tries to solve. But it's a bit, I think all those levels need to match, and you need to have all those parts of the chain in place before it actually becomes feasible.
And I think an interesting thing to think about is, like, right now, how much do you pay for electricity per year? Do you know?
So a good question as well. Yeah, could it say?
Well, in my case, it's about 500 GB pounds per year, which is a little well-insulated place. But then I don't have a car. But if you would have a car, how much do you pay for your petrol per year? Maybe quite a bit more, right? I have a heat pump, but maybe if you would have an electrical like a say gas boiler, you pay for your gas bill, maybe another 500 or 1,000 or whatever. So the total energy cost of you as a person, like the amount of energy that you buy, is probably a few thousand, if not more, 5,000 euros per year. Right now, only 1/3 or so is electricity. If that all becomes electrified, you'll start caring a bit more about how you're using your electricity. You'll care a bit more who your retailer is. You care a bit more about being smart. So when that in that electrification, electricity might become more expensive, but also the amount of electricity you'll consume becomes a lot larger. So I hope that will create some attention. If you think about the energy crisis, right? But 2 years ago, we had this massive energy crisis. We're at the brinks of collapse in Europe, very much involved in that one. Suddenly, everybody knew what a kilowatt hour was, and everybody knew, whoa, what is marginal pricing? That's crazy that these prices are varying like that, and they're set to gas. They're not set to gas. Gas is just often the marginal unit. I had to explain that many times. So if you have very high prices, suddenly people become very smart with the way they start using electricity. I mean, there's this example of my colleague who always said it, like in Spain, they started subsidizing electricity, but gas remained equally expensive. So what the guy did is, instead of heating his house with his gas boiler, he just opened up his electrical oven and opened the plate and used that to heat his house. So that happens when you create bad subsidies. And imagine that electrical oven was energized by a gas power plant that was burning fuel, right? Which is way worse than just using your electrical boiler. But people start being creative and thinking. So it's just, we have to wait until it becomes important enough in the budget to unleash that revolution, I hope.
Yeah, interesting. So as we move more towards electrification, more consumer budget goes into electricity, and somehow that should create awareness and maybe better optimization. Okay, so then we talked about different AI applications, also different challenges. We just said that the retailers can gain from investing in AI and basically optimization. As we do this technological transition, where should investment come from? Should it be from the retailer or different actors of the grid system, or maybe from a country level or European level?
Investment. I mean, the idea in electricity was always that the invisible hand will figure it out. I mean, we have been liberalizing the sector since the early 90s. I mean, the first European directive was the late 90s, and since then we have been sort of gradually trying to create private decision-making and private capital to invest into power plants. It has mostly been gas-fired power plants, because nuclear has always been sort of government-supported, renewables and as well. Now we have noticed that sort of that idea, which is also spillover in Australia, in the US, the rest of the world, maybe a bit less Latin America, but it didn't really deliver as much as we were thinking it would deliver, just because of those characteristics that electricity is extremely uncertain, the prices you can get. It's extremely politically sensitive. Because if you do an investment like 5 years ago, you think, okay, great, I hope that prices are rising, right? And suddenly prices were rising during the energy crisis. And then what happens in many countries? They start capping the prices, they start doing things like windfall profit taxation and so on. So you know that some of these high prices you can actually not rely on, which is really sort of resisting you to do that investment. And therefore, you need certainty of investment. Who will sign a 20-year contract with you, or if you're a developer of a power plant? A retailer? No, their consumers have contracts for 1 or 2 years. They don't want to sign a deal for 20 years. So therefore, you need an intermediary, which has been a system operator, which then organizes sort of capacity mechanism, which is then additional revenue to sort of secure enough capacity that system operator then foresees in the future. Or you have the government that is then sort of on behalf of all consumers is auctioning off contracts, which has mostly been for renewables, because otherwise they would have not been built. As we said before, they would have been too expensive. But soon you could think similarly for things like batteries or for other units that we think we need, but that the market cannot deliver. So where we come from is sort of, we wanted to have a pure sort of market system, but now we create a sort of competition for the market, meaning you have sort of auctioning for who will actually build those generators, and with the counterparty being a sort of centralized agent, and then competition within the market. So once the things are built, you actually try to compete for who's selling and who's best in maintenance, who's best in sort of figuring out strategy. So it's not a pure market system like restaurants or whatever you want.
Yeah. And I think if we look at investments in AI or in AI solutions, I think indeed it's interesting to look at the different levels, because something that we sometimes hear is, it needs to be figured out on the European or global level. So why should we invest in figuring it out, right? So I think that's partially true. I think there's a lot of challenges that need to be solved across a lot of different players, but I think everyone is in their own specific context as well. Different countries have different contexts, different regulatory contexts, different weather contexts, different. So I think it's there needs to be a more centralized investment in how to approach certain problems, but I think individual players will still need to invest in how to apply it to their context. And there's only, it's an industry with not that many players, especially for the more regulated ones. So I think the market is not that big to build a lot of products that can be used across the different players. So I do think there's an investment needed for everyone in their specific context.
Because centralization is not equating to let's renationalize and let the governments do it. It's sort of, you need a sort of central coordinator, but you still want, as much as you can, private capital, private decision making, because you need lots of investment. And it goes to almost like your political vision, right? But there's a good reason that we started liberalizing these sectors in the early 90s, because they were not the most efficient sector in the world. But it's complicated because you need to map regulation and market rules onto a very complicated techno-physical system. So, but I think what we believe is that on the long run, it does make sense to make people compete and to go for profit in order to sort of improve that system, because innovation is going to be massive, and a government central entity is not necessarily has that reputation of delivering that kind of product. But that is maybe my own opinion.
Yeah, I think there are many points of view to have, but it's super interesting. So like more centralized regulation from the government, but then still
steering of private agents.
Okay, of private agents. Okay, super interesting. So let's maybe talk a little bit about more AI trends and how they apply to then the energy industry. So of course, if we talk about AI trends these days, we got to talk about Gen AI. How is Gen AI applicable to or impacting the energy industry today?
Yeah, so I think we already discussed a bit the things up to now were mostly forecasting, optimization. I think those are big things, but Gen AI has its role as well. So there's things cross-industry like productivity improvements, back office automation, and so on, which are relevant for energy as well. Then I think a bigger one for retail is customer service, very important for those players, and something where we see a lot of use cases. But then I also think, even more energy specific. We see, for instance, a lot of complexity on these power plants. So I think helping to provide a singular interface for a lot of technical documentation, or helping to understand technical documentation can help. Or in the process of extending infrastructure, there's a lot of permitting work to be done and so on. So I think in those cases, there's a very big opportunity to leverage the later Gen AI techniques as well. And maybe, to go into it, those are mostly the unstructured based techniques, right? Text-based techniques. So it's about document understanding and generation.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it makes sense that there's, of course, technical difficulty, and to have this document AI and maybe retrieval augmented generation to help understand a lot of technical documentation.
Is that sort of simplification of the administration of everything, or is that too simple?
I think that's indeed something it can help with, and that's cross-industry. I think what is new with Gen AI is that you can work with unstructured data. Before we have the analytical AI, you work with structured numerical data. Now you can feed in documents, and the AI can understand the document or help answer questions about it. or help extract constraints. So those kind of things are a lot easier than they were. So I think everything that is document based has been made a lot easier. And there I just think like if you look at some of the challenges in Belgium as well, like the permitting process for new infrastructure is definitely a big one, I would say. So I think if I see opportunities to help there, I think if it can help, then it would be beneficial for everyone.
I definitely think that's helping navigating administration is always good. So if AI can help,
you can get rid of the need for consultants like myself.
But we are also consultants, so I hope we're not moving away from needing consultants too fast. Okay, right. So we talked about Gen AI, which is of course a very visible trend in AI in general. We talked about like prediction and optimization, which is just of course very prevalent in the energy sector for a long time. Are there any trends that are going under the radar in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think Gen AI has taken the stage, but just beneath the stage, there's some interesting things. So I think one is for instance, weather models. So there's been, over the past few years, a lot of improvements on AI weather models. And even though they could, in theory, beat some practical, more physics-based systems already in the past, they were not really practical, like based on like which data they needed or the granularity they could make predictions on. But I think we're now approaching the point where that's shifting. So they're applying a lot of new techniques. They're applying, for instance, Gen AI to weather maps, but also new forecasting techniques, which make them a lot more usable. And I think if you look at forecasting techniques, it's not always about having more advanced models, but a lot more about how to use the insights or how to integrate them. So, for instance, we talked about the retail side being very important, right? And you have all this granularity in your data of individual consumers, but we see that in practice, it's often you get better results by just forecasting the aggregated level and not using the detailed information at all. So, for instance, you now see more hierarchical prediction methods coming up, which do like multitask learning to do forecasts on multiple levels at the same time. And that way you combine a bit the more detailed information with then the aggregated level, which captures more trends and smooths out outliers and so on. I think a second one, moving a lot to more real-time forecasting, a lot more real-time markets.
And these weather models you talk about, how far in the future are you looking?
It depends on the model. So there are ones that do it on a couple of weeks, and there's ones that do it on a couple of hours. Like I know Google has one that looks a couple of hours ahead for rain that is integrated into their weather app. But you have some of the longer term as well, and they're very strong at better predicting extreme weather events, for instance, or predicting them more upfront. So those look mostly a couple of weeks ahead. And you have then a lot of models actually like simulate the whole global weather system, which is why they're not very practical. And then you can zoom in on like one specific part, but you need to simulate the whole global weather system. So you need global data as well, which is a bit what I meant, like not practically useful. But those things are changing, more regional models, more, not practically useful for individual players or...
Well, right now, like a couple of weeks ago, at least they're talking about investing in a big cable between the US and the UK. I don't know, it's what was it, about 3,000 kilometers or something? So, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's one way to make that sort of renewable power system work, is to have the global interconnection. And it's not really a technical problem, it's more geopolitical. Like there was always this idea, let's just couple North Africa with Europe and then we just push solar panels in the desert and we're going to solve it. But you already don't want to rely on gas from the Russians or oil from the Qatari or the Saudi, then you don't want to put your cables there neither, because you're much more fragile in a sort of electricity system than you are in these other commodities that at least you can store for a couple of weeks or months. But I'm diverging a bit. But but what you're saying, okay, so you don't do like these climate assessment models because that would be helpful for like policymakers.
That it has as well. For instance, a very nice one is Earth 2 by NVIDIA. So it's a digital twin of the Earth, and it's a climate digital twin. So they do a lot of climate simulation. So that's more long term, but then also shorter term for weather forecasting. So there's definitely things being looked at. So I think they are useful in some cases, but it's I think if you look at individual players, for instance, individual bounce responsible parties and so on, I don't think they were as feasible yet. And now that's a bit shifting towards where you can get very detailed insights for your specific asset from them as well.
If you can predict that the bad weather will happen in 3 or 4 days, you can earn lots of money.
Yeah.
Especially with storage over a couple of days, you just fill it up with storage. And it's like, that the stock will start like jumping up in 3-4 days, and then you're just ready to buy.
Yeah. So I think that's
which is good for everyone, right? Because otherwise price would be even higher if nobody comes.
And that's definitely one of the big trends. But then, as I mentioned, I think forecasting as well, like the integration. Like another one is probabilistic forecasting. Like in the past, a lot of forecasts were like one data point coming out of them, and now it's probabilities, like this much chance of being this weather, this much chance of being this weather, and so on. So I think that like the forecast itself might not really improve, which is what I mean with not necessarily better model, but you provide more information to take decisions on, like you can more
easily know what you don't know.
Indeed, you know a bit more about your uncertainties, and I think it's a lot about those things, like making them more useful. And then another one, like, again, we move to more real-time forecasting, but working on real-time data is a big challenge. It can lag, it can have some missing data and so on. So there we see, for instance, residual forecasting, where you then predict like longer-term trends on longer-term data, and then predict granularities based on like real short-term data. And then if it's correct, like you win from it, but if you have data issues, then at least your trends are still fine. So again, based on what do you make decisions, I think it's a lot about that. How do you integrate forecasting? How do you forecast multiple parameters which are dependent on each other? It's a lot about improvements on those kind of parts, instead of having a model that predicts like 1% better.
Yeah, no, but it makes sense. I mean, like I think a lot of the forecasting is also used for basically markets. So like adjusting prices of energy. So in a sense, if you also predict what you don't know, if you have like these confidence intervals, I guess you can also adapt your market position a bit better. Yeah, super interesting. Okay, so then maybe moving into more ethical aspects for within the energy industry, in your point of view, Tim, like what are ethical and security considerations to take into account?
Yeah, I think there really are some dangerous things. So what I was talking about, for example, these electrical vehicles, right? So right now there's already retailers that control literally 10,000 of vehicles in certain country, if not more. So if those ones, they get hacked, and imagine you have a lot more vehicles and they're sort of concentrated, you can really blow up the grid. Because if you start like charging them all at full power, they're all plugged in, it's in the middle of the night, right? And then at a certain hour, you just say, everybody just go full power. You can bring it down. I mean, not yet today, but in 5 or 7 years you can. So the sort of coordinated consumption or production in basically geographical areas that are quite small, you can really create lots of trouble. Because that controllability is very helpful, but if it's used against you, because the electricity system is so fragile, you have reserves for, often at the European scale, you have reserves for about, if 2 nukes go down at the same moment. It's about 3,000 something megawatt. 3,000 megawatt is not that much. Like a fast charger is, 60 kilowatt or something? I mean, I'm not going to do the calculation in my head or I'm going to be embarrassed, but it just means you don't need that many cars connected to
blow up the system. Huh? Yeah, that's interesting. But so isn't it kind of, I'd say like extra sensitivity points or extra vulnerability points to have all these basically electric system or electric charging system? Because I feel like it's already like cyber warfare is already a lot around like breaking electric systems, right? Like I think all the major
Ukraine,
players.
Zaporizhzhia is exactly that.
Exactly. Like I think they always say the first step into this type of warfare would be like break out all the electric systems. So I guess it's already kind of a threat, but maybe having more electricity points, it's more.
I mean, how you do it
vulnerability.
now, right? Is you sort of bomb the power station or you literally cut the cable. But with those appliances, you have agents on the system that you can literally control, and yeah, you only need literally a couple of milliseconds of a massive impact, and the thing just, you have this what they call cascading, right? Because the frequencies start deviating. The moment the frequency starts deviating, different appliances will go off. Things get worse, cascading failure, and it's too late.
Yeah.
It happens every decade or so in the big countries.
Yeah, so I think it highlights the need for secure systems, basically. Like,
yeah, or I mean, you guys are technically way better than I am, so you need something to avoid that to happen.
Exactly, basically like guardrails and security systems. Okay, okay. One of the interesting aspects of AI, one thing that's often highlighted, one of the basically negative side of AI, is also the need of energy to train and serve all those big AI models, especially in the era of large language models. Do you expect also the benefit of AI in optimizing all electric system to kind of even out the? Do you believe that AI will have a net positive impact on this regard?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think indeed the energy usage, like you see news from AI companies building nuclear plants or putting data centers in space to get solar energy and so on. So it shows that the energy usage is really blowing up quite a bit. It's driven mostly by Gen AI. What we do see there is a tremendous drop in energy usage per, let's say, token per output of the model, but you see a lot more usage as well. So I think there it needs to be part of the trade-off on is this a use case we want to solve with Gen AI or not? I think that's one of the costs to take into account, but again, can be a lot of benefits as well. And then if we look more at the analytical AI, forecasting, optimization, and so on, there the energy usage is a lot lower, and I would say the trade-off is very easily to the side of the bigger benefit because they help to integrate more renewable energy on the grid. They help to prevent additional infrastructure investment needs because you can more optimally use the infrastructure that you have. And I think there the trade-off is definitely towards a positive side.
I cannot hold myself back on that one, is that these things, these data centers and so on, it really matters where you put them and how do you use them, right? And this is, again, the Texas example, one of my favorites. If you like electricity markets, Texas is sort of textbook, sort of how I would do it, even though they had the storm, but that was outside of their control in 2021. Where are the data centers? Well, the data centers are in the Panhandle. The Panhandle is like the top of Texas where they have massive amount of wind, and they just go into site next to that wind. Maybe not like the data centers, I mean, not all of them because latency is important and stuff, but all these crypto miners and some of these things that are not real-time applications, they go sit next to the windmill. Why do they do that? Because the electricity prices next to those windmills are extremely low because you have locational pricing in Texas, which means you get perfect information about where and when there is actually excess or abundance of electricity, prices go low, negative, where you actually need electricity. Right now in European countries, the electricity price in the wholesale is the same across the whole country. Same in GB, Belgium. I mean, they each have its own national price, right? There's exemptions. Like in Sweden, you have 4 prices. In Norway, you have, I think, 4 or 5 now. Italy have 10 or 11. But all the other nations, they have one country, one price. But all the wind in GB, Great Britain, is in Scotland. They're not around London. But the price that a data center would have to pay for 1 kilowatt hour of electricity is the same where you put yourself next to London. Maybe the ground price is quite different, or next to Scotland. while at the same time you're throwing away so much wasted electricity in Scotland all the time because the transmission lines are not built fast enough to keep up with the way that the windmills are built out. If you would add locational pricing, all these data centers and stuff, they would fleet up to Scotland, which is great because now, instead of sucking up electricity that would be really valuable close to the load, you're actually consuming electricity that otherwise would have been wasted, right? Because there's no load. So you need a market that actually signals when and where electricity is extremely valuable. And there, again, we know how to do it, but it goes really slow because these are very political processes. There's winners and losers, but it's a lot of consumer money that is just through the drain. The drain.
Yeah, it's funny because early in the podcast, like you were talking about just consumer level, electricity consumption, that it should be overnight, that the appliance should optimize, but so also for data centers, then in a way we should have more dynamic pricing to kind of optimize
time and
the
space.
demand. Time and space.
We already have a bit of time and space. Like right now, the price in electricity in Europe is at wholesale level is each hour. It's different price. We should in June go to each 15 minutes. It is already better, right? Because within 1 hour, can be this. If the sun is rising, the amount of solar you get in these first 15 minutes is pretty different than these last 15 minutes, right? Which then again reduces the cost of the amount of reserves you need, because now you don't have to make up for the market not seeing that granular thing, right? It's a lot more complicated than that, but you get the twist.
No, interesting, very interesting. Okay, so maybe another topic would be more flexibility markets. In this context, flexibility tackles imbalanced electricity prices, how to balance basically the demand also with basically flexibility. I think one of the concern for investing in flexibility is how future-proof it is. Like if the flexibility is kind of optimized, then the price margin of imbalanced electricity might kind of slow down. So is it worth really investing in flexibility or not? What's your point of view on that?
It depends. How do you define flexibility, right? I think in the last European regulation, for the first time, they put a definition of flexibility is the ability to quickly change what you were planning to do in terms of consumption and production. Mostly in the recent past, flexibility meant like being really quick for if there's a certain outage or an imbalance, and then you need something like a battery to react. And those are mostly like system bulk level problems. Now flexibility is also used a lot to you have lots of network constraints, and then you need something that in the wholesale market, unfortunately they're ignoring the network, and then you need something that after the wholesale market is cleared to match the physics with the markets again, so redispatching and all that stuff, which is the other type of flexibility. The problem is, that these things get cannibalized quite quick, right? So since the batteries have been, again, UK was one of the first, Australia, Texas, massive amount of batteries, and the prices for those ancillary services, frequency response, have been basically massively being cannibalized by batteries coming in. Which is dangerous because you don't want the next battery to come in because you know that will kill your business case and so on, because those markets are very thin. It's a matter of a few hundreds of megawatts. Again, you need instruments that guarantee a long-term income.
Are you then talking about reserve markets specifically, or also like the short-term markets? They call it the stacking, right? So batteries, they were very active in these frequency markets because they were the fastest one. And these markets were actually pretty well paid because your competitors were power plants that cost a lot of money to provide these services. Then those ones in many countries, prices have been dropping, even though you would think with more renewables, you need more reserves, but not necessarily if you're able to have better forecasts and all these things. But then, of course, they do more and more arbitrage in the wholesale market. So it's just buy low, sell high, which often means buy during noontime in solar systems and then sell again in the afternoon. But that it takes a while until those margins get cannibalized. But then it's a bit of a race of, do you have as much batteries coming on the system as you have new renewables coming in? And as long as that pace is equal, then probably those arbitrages will remain in place.
But again, it's a risky business to do these investments. But if a crisis comes along, things like batteries or interconnectors, they feast on chaos, right? Because suddenly price differences are like, wow, during the day, you already saw it like 2 weeks ago. During the day, prices were like 50, 100 at noon in Germany, and in the evening, they were 1,000. If you're a battery like that, a couple of days like that, you're good for the whole year.
Yeah, and then something we saw on the Belgian market was like imbalance prices dropping due to European integration. Like, what effect do you see there? Because this is from cannibalization. Are there other trends like which impact the future business case?
Yeah, this is really, as a consumer, something to cheer for, right? Because that's a good thing. Imagine Belgium has too much electricity, and they're all trying to pay people to consume more. And then the Dutch have at the same time too little electricity, and they all pay people to please generate more. Well, if you just talk to each other, then probably you kind of can net out the problem and you don't have to pay anybody anymore. So that is, we can only profit from that, from these sort of efficiency savings. But yeah, what will that? It is good because it will indicate how much flexibility you need, right? If you don't do these things, you'll just over-invest and over-procure, and you could use that money for something more useful, like building more cables or another type of technology. That's why these prices are guidance of the type of investment. If they're wrong, then it will just be more costly.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a contradiction, right? It's in all of our benefit, but on the other hand, like you mentioned before as well, like it's hard to know the business case. Like, are there things that you can do to solidify your business case, like certain markets to focus on, certain kinds of flexibility to focus on, something that can give you some more certainty if you invest in either, let's say, flexible capacity or in optimization of that capacity?
I mean, now you see in many countries that they start introducing what they call flexibility products or flexibility support schemes or stuff like that. At the European level, that was one of the outcomes of the European energy crisis. Then they created this sort of update of the regulation. And one of the things was we need to have countries doing flexibility support schemes, sort of long-term contracts or CapEx support to sort of push these developers over the line if the sort of business case is too risky. What else is just, stacking revenues, right? Trying to be active in as many markets as possible, which is these ancillary service reserves markets, then wholesale arbitrage markets that we already said, maybe things like capacity markets that you say, okay, my battery, I'll make sure that if the system is in these 5 most tight hours of the year, I'll be sure that I have enough energy in my battery and I get paid because they know that they can rely on me and they don't need to invest in a gas plant for that sort of adequacy reason. Then you have all these use cases at the local level, right, where you have network constraints and the battery or the other flexible asset can solve as a substitute for a network investment. So you need to add all these things up, and then it's a bit like a portfolio, right? Not everything goes well, but at least there will always be something that sort of pops up. And then I assume you can really de-risk that more. You don't put all your eggs in one basket, or how do they say it in English?
Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, okay, some challenges, but then still kind of a lot of opportunities in that type of investment. All right, so with that, I think we covered a lot of topics today. So I think we can conclude here. I wanted to really thank you both for attending and for the very interesting insights. There again, a couple of takeaways I have is to pretty much create this dynamic system for optimizing demand basically on a time level, you said, or in a spatial level as well. And then all the different opportunities for AI. And there again, like there's a lot in traditional AI and some trends that are going a little bit more under the radar. So thanks a lot. And to the audience, we'll come back next time with an episode on fast-moving consumer goods. So stay tuned.